Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. Great to see you all. My name is Jesse Abrams, and I have the pleasure of introducing our Warnell seminar speaker, Dr. Zhao. I've known Dr. Ma. Was just reminiscing. We met in 2010 for the first time in Corpus Christi, Texas, at a conference. We run in very similar circles. We do very similar sorts of work. She just does better than I do. It's like that meme, right?
For today's topic.
So Dr. Ma is a professor of natural resource social science at Purdue University in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. Got a PhD in natural resources science and management from the University of Minnesota, and a master's in sustainable international development from Brandeis. She does really interesting work related to both individual and organizational decision making under contextual change. She's done work in the US, Bolivia, Peru, China, Pakistan. She's published over 100 peer-reviewed journal articles, gotten millions of dollars in grants. She's advised students, postdocs, and she's also the associate editor for two journals, Society of Natural Resources and Environmental. So we're very fortunate to have her with us today. So I'm going to give her the floor. So please welcome Dr. Ma.
Thank you, Jesse. It's really nice to be back here. In fact, this is my second visit. I've been studying teeth. Last year, I came in June, and the campus was much quieter, right? Students were gone, but this time it felt really different. And I actually really like the energy. I like people. So I guess I'm in the right discipline of social science, right? If I don't like people, imagine how that would go. So very happy to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you a little bit about my work. Just a full disclaimer, about 4 or 5 days ago, I was in Bolivia, and I suddenly decided I'm going to do something different for this seminar. So I, like many other professors, will have like a stack of slides we normally use, compose a new talk based on the audience, but it's pretty much recycling the same material. But I had a moment of epiphany. I'm like, I'm going to do something totally different. And I can't tell you how much regret I had last night when I was going through this. So for the students in the room, don't do what I just did. But I really appreciate the opportunity to kind of push me to think a little bit differently about my work beyond individual projects. And that's what I'm going to do today, is kind of to use my research program to kind of demonstrate a couple points that I would like to make more broadly. I will talk a little bit briefly about my research program in general. I want to describe the central premise upon which my research program is built, and also what I have been doing to challenge that central premise by posing 3 core arguments. And then I will kind of walk through a series of projects I've done in my career, just all very briefly, to illustrate these core arguments that I'm hoping to convince you of. And now I will share a few closing thoughts. So I am an interdisciplinary environmental social scientist. I work a lot with different social science theories and different methods from different disciplines, kind of bring them together to try to study human-environment interaction. So most of my research is really centered on the question about how individuals and organizations make decisions to manage resources, conserve the environment, and adapt to different kind of changes in their lives. So one of the key signature or nature component of my research is collaborative in nature, right? So all my research projects are collaborative. Till this day, I'm actually quite proud to say I've never published a single author paper. Every single paper of my 100-something paper is all co-authored. And it's not always easy, right? As I was going through promotion and tenure, I did have colleagues ask me, how, if you never had a single author paper, how do you claim your scholarship, right? And my scholarship is interdisciplinary collaborative, right? So I just want to make that point. Broadly speaking, kind of all my different projects fall into 3 types of decisions. One is resource management decision, there's conservation decision, there's adaptation decision. And if you look at the literature, they tend to exist in different bodies of literature, different disciplines, but I have been trying to kind of bring them together under this broader umbrella of human dimensions of natural resources and global change. And to look at these different decisions, I've worked on a lot of different contexts, different geographies, right? I've worked on forest conservation management. That's always been a staple in my research program. I've looked at human-wildlife conflict issues. I've looked at water governance issues. I work on, smallholder farming, urban forestry, climate adaptation, restoration is something new I'm working in. The space I'm working in, wildfire management. You think about the natural resource topic, probably at one point in my career, I've had some kind of project in that area, right? I have a little bit of academic ADHD. I need to shift around quite a bit and keep myself engaged and interested. But generally speaking, they're all about individual and organizational decision-making in the context of change. My work has taken me to a lot of different places around the globe, and I have had the opportunity and the privilege to really work with a lot of different communities in different geographies, which has been really, really fun. So today I'm going to do a little bit of sampling of different projects from different places to kind of share with you a few take-home points I want to make today. A last disclaimer before we start talking about the actual research, the central premise that guiding my research is you'll probably hear me using we a lot, right? As I said, I'm a very collaborative person, and when I say we, I really mean the group of collaborators, students, postdocs I've been working with, right? And these are just a collage of all the amazing individuals in my human dimensions lab. Who, formal members of my human dimension lab, but of course, the work I present today represent a whole community effort beyond all the faces you see on the screen. Okay, so now switch gear to talk about this central premise, right, that I've been thinking about, kind of guiding my research that I'm trying to challenge through my research. If you look at the natural resource management field, environmental conservation field, or adaptation programs out there, generally speaking, I would say they fall under one of these four models, right? Either people don't know about it, they don't know the importance of the environment, they don't know how to do something, educate them, right? It's a kind of information deficit model. Or people don't have the money, or they don't have enough resources to really adopt whatever the desirable practices we want them to adopt. So give them financial incentives, right? Cost share payments, what have you. Or we really need to think about technologies to improve efficiency, effectiveness of managing different things. So we need to develop technology. And Pete, Krista, we're all in the same project, digital forestry, right? It's all about technology. So this technology is also a very commonly focused area within natural resources and conservation. The last one is that people don't have the capacity. They want to do something. They want to, they want to engage. They want to adopt conservation, but they don't really know how to. So then maybe we should capacity building everybody and provide training workshops and all of that. Of course, there has been a lot of amazing work done using these models, right? But I would argue, in fact, sometimes these models can be quite problematic, right? One reason is it tends to lead to this idea of us and them, right? Researchers and research participants, professionals versus community members. And this kind of dichotomy is not always a very accurate depiction of what's happening on the ground, and it's not always helpful, right? The second reason I find these models can be problematic is that there are a wide range, I would argue there are a wide range of alternative explanations for why things happen the way they happen, right? There could be a lot of different factors that we need to consider. Without thinking about them, we might risk mischaracterizing or misunderstanding situations and resource management issues and potentially misinform conservation or management efforts on the ground, right? So that leads to the three core arguments I would like to make. And I will show you now, and I will give you all the empirical evidence from my research. And at the end, I will show you this slide again. You can tell me if you buy my arguments. Right? The first one I would say is economic consideration and ecological or environmental information. While very important, they're rarely sufficient on their own to trigger behavioral change. My second argument is there are a wide range of social, psychological, cultural, institutional factors that shape resource management, conservation, and adaptation decisions in the context of social ecological change across a variety of geographies and resource topics, right? And the last argument I would make is that resource management, conservation, adaptation decisions are not singular or isolated events. Rather, decision-making is ongoing processes of changing beliefs, adjusting actions, through which communities and individuals simultaneously address multiple stressors in their lives, right? So these are my three arguments, and my goal today is to use a variety of examples from my research program across different geographies, population of interest, and context to illustrate these three core arguments. So before I start going through these examples, I do want to have this one quick method slide so that I don't have to repeat myself for every single project I will share. All of my projects are mixed method, right? So basically every single project is combining some kind of qualitative and quantitative data collections and analysis. And depending on the particular project, we might actually also use secondary data, incorporate biological, ecological data. We use quite a bit of participatory methods, right? Participatory mapping. And I just learned from a PhD student of mine in the last 2 years, this new method called body territory mapping is also pretty cool. We do participant observation, and of course, a good old interviews, focus group, and survey, right? So all my projects are mixed methods, just by default. Okay, so I started thinking about, the three core arguments very early on in my career. When I was a new assistant professor, I was invited by this group of irrigation engineers and climate scientists to look at this system in the Less Plateau region of China. So it's northwest of China. It's quite arid and very agriculture based. A lot of smallholder farmers. And what's interesting is for the area, climate change has been a concern for quite a while, and the government has really invested a lot of resources on water-saving irrigation as adaptation strategy to help farmers, help agriculture to address climate concerns. So the government spent a lot of money investing in farmer outreach about water-saving irrigation technology, and they also have provided a lot of financial incentives. And in many cases, they actually just put in drip irrigation systems for free, right? But the problem that our irrigation engineers there notice is very often these systems, people are not interested, or even if you put them in free, after a couple of years, they're abandoned. They just couldn't understand. It's not an information issue. It's not a money issue. Like, why on earth people wouldn't use these adaptation strategies to help them address climate concerns, like deal with water shortage and generate all of these other benefits. So as the only social scientist on the team, I was brought in to try to understand kind of smallholder farmer decision making. So we worked in these three provinces in that part of China. And we again combined unstructured and semi-structured interviews and a household survey. What we learned, there were two main reasons why drip irrigation as a community water-saving irrigation technology was not very popular among farmers. One is we realized adoption of drip irrigation really requires cooperation among different farming households because in China, the land tenure system set up since 1970s is people have a lot of small plots of land, but they're not connected, right? So I could have a piece of land here and a piece of land there. It's just all over the place, and every plot of land is relatively small. So in order to have a drip irrigation system going in, you're basically having drip lines going through multiple people's property at the same time, right? And these drip lines very often, for in addition to deliver water, they also put fertilizer in this drip lines. At the same time, you irrigate and fertilize your crop at the same time, right? But farmers actually plant different crops on different plots of land. So you could have green beans and then corn and then soy, and then they're all connected by the same drip line. So that's not very helpful in terms of irrigation scheduling and also the amount of fertilizer, the type of fertilizer they need. And also, farmers in that area post the 1970s, right, when the collective farming system collapsed, they have not been working together at all. It's a very individualistic state, country, right? We always think about communist, socialist, but it's actually the most capitalist country I've ever been to, right? People are very individualistic, it's very profit driven, right? So people haven't really worked together at all. So to basically now having a drip line connected them and require them to coordinate and talk to each other, negotiate with each other was extremely difficult, right? And there's a lack of trust and social cohesion within communities. Because of what happened politically and at a larger scale socially. And there's not really very effective mechanism for people to resolve their differences and basically to engage in conflict resolution. So this led to a lot of disputes over water timing and fertilizer distribution. Farmers manipulating the infrastructure. Sometimes they cut the drip line, and so where they do all sorts of funny things, right, to basically increase the water coming to their property. And then eventually a lot of that led to the abandonment of system in some of the villages, right? So really it's not about the financial incentives. It's not about getting the drip line for free. It's really about this very weak collective institution and the lack of governance structure that undermine people's adoption of drip irrigation, right? A second reason we learned is that drip irrigation actually really conflicted with smallholder livelihood strategies and their labor priorities, right? So farmers in that area, they really prioritize off-farm work and labor migration, right? And then they actually preferred time-saving crops such as corn, even though the yield, it's not a very profitable crop, but it's a pretty easy crop to grow, right? So it doesn't require a lot of time to take care of those crops. So even though drip irrigation has a lot of benefit in terms of, climate, water, and also reduce total physical labor, it does require more frequent irrigation events, right? You have to kind of adjusting your drip schedule, like your irrigation schedule. It really is shifting the labor timing in ways that interfere with people's ability to go to the nearby town to engage in wage labor or migrate for like a month at a time to the cities to get a higher wage, right? Again, it requires coordination among households and increase the monitoring burdens to prevent neighbors from manipulating the system, right? For these two reasons, nothing to do with the economic side of things, right? The direct economic side of things in terms of the cost of putting in the drip irrigation, really, that's why the adoption has not been very, very helpful, very successful, right? So basically from that study, I started to think, maybe the adoption of conservation practices and adaptation strategies, even when they're technically sound and financially subsidized, maybe they really depend on a much broader range of factors beyond just financial considerations, right? And you may say, okay, that's smallholder farmers in China. That's a very different social, economic, political system. But we also observed a very similar phenomenon in the agriculture communities in the U.S., precisely in the Midwest U.S. among livestock producers. So a couple of years ago, I was talking to wildlife managers in Indiana, and I heard this story about how an increasing number of livestock producers are complaining about livestock predation from black vultures. So historically, black vultures actually live in kind of Florida, right? But because of climate change and all of these things, their territories start pushing north. And now it's like very established in Kentucky and also in Indiana. And then wildlife managers hear a lot of murmuring and complaints from livestock producers how black vultures kill their calf. But black vulture is actually scavenger, right? They don't really just kill unless there's some kind of opportunistic way for them to, take a stillborn calf or some animal that, baby animal that's super weak, right? But still from the perception of livestock producer, black vulture is a threat to their production, and people are more and more interested in using lethal control. But the problem is black vulture is protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty. So there's a lot of conflict and a lot of tension there, right? So again, as the social scientists brought into the team to understand sort of the ecological and human dimensions of black vulture management, we started this project, right? So we collected survey data, analyzed survey data from Indiana and Kentucky, and then we use this structural equation model to try to understand what are the drivers of livestock producers' tolerance of black vultures. And we particularly use the Kansky model, like the wildlife tolerance model, to build our empirical model, and now we used our data to basically test the model. So I'm going to focus on 4 particular factors here. In the original wildlife tolerance model, it included tangible benefits, tangible cost, intangible cost, and intangible benefit as potential predictor of wildlife tolerance. In the case of black vulture, we couldn't really identify any tangible benefit, so that variable was not measured, but we were able to measure the other 3 variables. What's really interesting is we found that intangible benefits, basically perceived ecological value of black vulture, they help clean up, the farm and all the afterbirth of, livestock and that sort of things. So perceiving intangible benefit did predict a small increase in tolerance, in black vulture tolerance. Similarly, perceiving intangible cost, which is measured as the negative emotion associated with black vulture predation and livestock loss, did predict a marginal decrease in black vulture tolerance, right? Okay, all right. Both the magnitude of impact was pretty small, but we see the direction that we're expecting to see. What's really significant in this study is the second point. We're actually able to show tangible cost associated with economic loss estimated from black vulture predation was not a significant predictor of black vulture tolerance at all, right? So you think about human-wildlife conflict, very often though the conflict are framed as an economic issue, right? A lot of solutions is really emphasizing, providing compensation to a livestock loss as a way to mitigate that kind of conflict, right? But from this study, we're able to show, in fact, the tangible cost was not a predictor of wildlife tolerance at all, right? So basically, from these 2 studies, both the drip irrigation case and black vulture case, we're able to show providing financial compensation or incentive alone is often not as sufficient as we would like to motivate behavior change, right? So that is about economic consideration, right? So moving beyond economics, I want to also talk a little bit about the role of information. So in this particular study, we had the opportunity to look at watershed residents' likelihood of adopting water quality improvement to reduce non-point source pollution in Indiana, particularly water quality issues in Lake Michigan. So we'll have a variety of questions, basically trying to understand what factors influencing watershed residents' likelihood to adopt water improvement practices. Again, we did, a large-scale survey and basically focusing on 2 counties, the only watershed encompassing 2 counties that drains into Lake Michigan. And one unique thing we did in this study is we embedded information experiment about non-point source pollution in the survey, right? So it's a survey experiment, and this information experiment is all about non-point source pollution, its causes, sources, potential impact, and what people can do to actually reduce non-point source pollution from their properties. What we found is, and then we measured people's likelihood, self-reported likelihood to engage in water quality improvement practices before the information treatment and after. Right? So it's a pretty standard before and after measure. What we found is exposure to information treatment have absolutely no statistically significant effect on resident adoption intention at all, right? So that was quite interesting. We expected to see some impact, maybe not huge, but we absolutely see, we saw no significant, statistically significant impact at all, right? But what we did see is the role of the power of social norms, right? I will talk a little bit more about it. Particularly, we were able to demonstrate perceived injunctive norms associated with water quality improvement was really a strong predictor of people's likelihood to adopt. Injunctive norm is one type of social norms. It basically describes what people believe their peers expect them to do, right? So it's kind of associated with social expectations of peers that they identify with, right? So that could be their families, their friends, their neighbors, or whatever, like other residents in the community or other farmers in their community. Right? So any peers they self-identify with, right? So in this study, we're able to show information alone, again, is not sufficient for motivating change, but we were able to start zooming in to look at the power of social norm. In fact, in this particular case, changing from not perceiving any injunctive norm to perceiving injunctive norm increased the odds ratio of self-reported likelihood to adopt water quality improvement practices by 67 times, right? So that is really huge. In fact, the most significant predictor in our model. And this power of social norms is not just happening in the water quality improvement context, right? We also see it very clearly in a completely different study, in a completely different context in terms of invasive plant management in Indiana, right? So in this study, we were concerned about the spread of non-native invasive plants in Indiana, and I was contracted by the U.S. Forest Service to actually look at factors influencing family forest owners' willingness to control invasive plants on their own property. For those of you who may not be familiar with family forest owners, these are just individuals and household own forest land. In fact, collectively, they're the largest landowner group in the continental United States, right? So they're a very important group of people to think about if we care about invasive plant control. So we combined, again, interviews and surveys and analyzed data from this, both qualitatively and quantitatively. What we found is that large proportion of family forest owners are quite aware of invasive plant issues, right? They're concerned about those invasive plants not only on their own properties, but also on their neighboring forest land. I just want to show you this quote. I really like it. It really demonstrates landowners, notice it's a problem and they're quite aware of what's happening. So this landowner said, my husband and I were walking around our property this morning, and I was complaining about the amount of multiflora rows that we had. I was complaining because we had to start working on it again after I have already worked on it before. As we were walking along our fence line, we noticed our neighbor's property is full of multiflora rows. And my husband made a good point, which I already know. At this point, this lady actually rolled her eyes a little bit and we chuckled. And she said, it doesn't do us any good because we have a seed source right there, right? So it's really like the landowners are pretty on top of this. They know this is an issue and they know everybody needs to be engaged in order for this problem to be under control. So another key result we learned from this study is landowners are strongly subject to normative social influence, again, from their perceived social groups. In this case, neighbors, they really, if they think their neighbors expect them to control invasive plants, they are much more likely to also control invasive plants. But also their families and friends and other forest landowners in their communities are also considered significant peers, and they recognize the social pressure from those peers as well. And when we throw this all into a regression, controlling for all these other common factors very often influence landowner decision making. Again, we see this purple one. You can read it, but I'm just gonna point it out. Normative social influence is one of the three strongest and most statistically significant predictor of landowners' intention to control invasive plants from their property in the next 5 years, right? So this power of social norms is really very, very strong, and it's really quite interesting. And I'm a huge fan of social norms. It kind of shows up in a lot of the work I do. And it's not only important in terms of influencing individual behavior, it also influences people's willingness to engage in collective action to manage a variety of natural resource issues, right? This is also an invasive plant study, but this time it's in Sassoon Marsh in California. And the local Sassoon Resource Conservation District is very interested in understanding both the ecological and human dimensions of invasive plant management in Sassoon Marsh. And their goal is to develop a coordinated regional invasive plant management plan for their whole area, right? So our team was brought in. I was the only social scientist working with excellent ecological scientists and GIS specialists trying to understand the barriers and opportunities for collective action across public, private land ownership in Sassoon Marsh. I do want to say a couple of things about Sassoon. It's quite special. I love that place. It's in the Bay Delta area, outside of San Francisco, between San Francisco and Sacramento, and it's the largest brackish wetland in Western United States. So ecologically, they're quite unique and important. One of the interesting things about Sassoon is it has a mix of a private and public land ownership. So basically, all these different colors here on the map representing different kind of land ownership, right? So there's a mosaic of mixed land ownership, which makes it an interesting system for social scientists to study. Invasive plants is one of the biggest threat to Sassoon Marsh, and particularly to all the the fishery resources, which also support waterfowl. A very healthy waterfowl population is on the flyway, right, migratory flyway, and a lot of people actually go there. There's basically a lot of very rich people from San Francisco. They duck hunt there, right? So it's actually a lot of money on the landscape. So it's not like people don't have money to control invasive plant. They have money. A lot of them are really, really, really quite having a lot of money, right? I visited those places. I was like, oh, okay, that's very different from the other landowners I've worked with, right? We're talking about very different, situations here. But invasive plants, nonetheless, is very, very important threat in that area. So, what we learned from that study is, again, most landowners and managers recognize the importance of collective action, especially for controlling invasive plants, like, the case in Indiana. People recognize if they just do control, but their neighbors don't do the same thing, then it really just kind of renders their effort useless, right? Because it is a collective action challenge. In this study, we're particularly interested in, understanding how people think about 4 possible models of collective action. How do people want to see themselves getting organized together to address invasive plants, right? So there's a paper I published with a few colleagues in Australia. Basically, we identified the 4 models of collective action, and then we asked the Sassoon landowners about these 4 models. And turned out everybody is excited about, express very strong support of all the different models. So we also learned that landowners and managers in Sassoon, again, they're strongly subjected to social norms, particularly injunctive and subjective norms, right? So if they think other duck clubs are expecting them to manage invasive plants, they would more likely to manage invasive plants. And if they, see other duck clubs are doing invasive management, then they would feel more pressure to do the same thing, right? So descriptively, again, we see the importance of social norms in this context. What we haven't done is actually to put the social norms against the other factors and figure out in sort of more in a regression context, the relative importance of social norms to other social factors, right? So we haven't done this bit. This is a study we just finished. So hopefully next time I come to UGA, I will tell you a little bit about that, right? But we do have quite a bit of evidence, and it's quite consistent from what we found in Indiana, that landowners are strongly subject to injunctive and subjective norms, and social norm is really something very important in shaping resource management decisions, conservation practices, and adaptation generally. All right. So beyond social factors, a lot of my work also looked at the psychological factors shaping decision making. One of the psychological factors that's really interesting to me is emotion, right? And talking to natural resource managers and professionals about emotions. Good luck, right? That's a part of that we try to suppress, right? But it's actually really important. In fact, we didn't go into the study to study emotion. It just kind of showed up as a very important topic, and we took advantage of that. So the study context is about white-tailed deer management. So a group of us at Purdue were contracted by the Indiana DNR Division of Fish and Wildlife to help do a study to inform an integrated deer management plan for the next 10 years. So again, we have all the ecologists, biologists, GIS people, and me, the lone social scientist, right? And my task was to try to understand how Indiana residents value, perceive, experience white-tailed deer population, particularly what kind of management outcomes Indiana residents desire from deer management by state agency and why, right? Also, we did, semi-structured interview, focus group. We did a large-scale survey of Indiana residents, included woodland owners, farmers, hunters, and also urban to suburban residents, right? So we did a stratified sampling and had this large-scale study. What was interesting is that in the qualitative phase, people were we went into just not thinking about emotion as a very important factor to study, but it became obvious in interviews and focus group, people get really emotional talking about their deer encounters, right? There were tears, there were people, slamming the table, right? We're like, okay, maybe we should actually look into the literature of emotion. And then turn out there's a huge amount of literature on emotion, right? So we're like, okay, maybe these are just interview and focus group participants, right? They're purposefully sampled. Maybe they don't quite represent the overall, importance of emotion in this context. So let's also incorporate a component in the survey to measure emotions and the influence of emotions. So a few key results we found about emotion. One is that people really harbor a mixed emotion towards deer and deer management. And, when you talk to forest landowners, sometimes they got really emotional, they really, like Indiana particularly, people love their walnut trees, right? And these walnuts are also very valuable. Black walnut can sell for like tens of thousands of dollars, right? When they talk about deer coming through and basically decimate the walnut seedling, they got really emotional, right? They got very frustrated, very angry. You see a lot of that. Then you think, okay, so landowners don't like deer because the deer jeopardize their crops or their walnuts or what have you. But sometimes you also talk to farmers and they're very tender towards deer. I love watching the deer, roaming around my property. As long as they don't eat my corn, it really brings me joy in the morning and see them and what have you, right? So you actually really can feel this very diverse, this very wide range of emotions existing in different groups of residents and also even within the same groups of residents, right? So that's the number one thing we found. Mixed emotions are felt by everyone towards deer and deer management. The second thing we found is emotions are really influenced by a variety of factors, right? Individual values and beliefs, the context of deer interaction becomes very, very important, and also power dynamics in deer management. Sometimes these emotions are not necessarily towards the deer. It's about how powerless they felt in terms of deer management, how little input, how little they felt they had been heard, right, when they raised the same problems again and again, right? So a lot of this emotion is really tied to the power dynamics associated with deer management. These are sort of all the very descriptive qualitative results, right? Then we kind of had the survey data back and we did, again, structured equation model, try to estimate the effect of emotion. In the human wildlife literature, there's actually pretty established evidence that attitudes towards wildlife really predict people's perceptions of wildlife management approaches, right? Particularly lethal control approaches. But in our study, we're able to demonstrate actually emotion play a huge role in mediating that relationship between attitude and acceptance of different wildlife management approaches, right? Particularly emotional effect, the acceptability of using lethal control to manage deer population. But that mediating effect is different based on the particular situation and the deer encounter people experience, right? So we actually observed a very strong mediating role of emotion when people are encountering a fawn or diseased deer. In the case of diseased deer, if somebody is 100% against lethal control of deer, right, and have very strong attitude, and then they don't support lethal control of deer, but if they have had an encounter with a sick deer, right, that really just suffering and from whatever disease they may have, that could completely mediating the effect of attitude on their acceptance of lethal control, 100%, right? It was fascinating. That mediating role also is pretty strong when people encounter a fawn. However, this mediating role of emotion really didn't play much of a role when people encounter a large buck or they're looking at a deer kind of just roaming around in the plants, right? So what we learned from this study is even when people hold positive or negative attitudes towards specific deer management approaches, their emotions can still either intensify or shift those attitudes depending on the context, right? So again, the power of emotion. And I was talking to Brian and Kelly earlier, right? Our state deer biologist was like on my student committee. And he said, well, all very interesting, fascinating stuff, right? You discover. What do you want me to do with this? Like, how do I incorporate emotion into my deer management plan? I still don't have an answer to his question, right? I keep providing and I keep proposing different ideas, and we still haven't figured out how exactly incorporate these discovery into true management. But I think it's still important to recognize the role of emotion and, broadly speaking, psychological factors in shaping people's perceptions and approach and practice of resource management. Okay, the whirlwind here, bear with me. In recent years, I have become more and more fascinated by another factor, which is relational value. Basically, relational value is, in the literature, it's talk about people's relational value with nature and also people's relational value with each other in the context of conservation and nature and resource management, right? So I have this long-term partner in Bolivia. It's a very well-established NGO. They have been implementing an incentive-based conservation program in most of Bolivia, basically giving local communities some kind of either cash or in-kind payments in exchange for people to adopt water and forest conservation practices, right? But traditionally, these incentive-based programs always come with conditions, right? People are being monitored. And if they're not doing what they're supposed to do, there will be penalty, right? So we call this a whole monitoring and enforcement of non-compliance penalty conditionality, right? But our team are inherently, kind of unconvinced about this sort of paternalistic nature of conditionality, right? And there's a lot of evidence how communities in the global south are actually very much, place a lot of non-economic value on the environment, on nature, and they really have a very different and complex relationship with nature. So we got an NSF grant to ask this very, in my mind, a novel question. Can unconditional payments produce similar environmental benefits as conditional payments, and also at the same time improve social equity outcomes of the program? And how do community members perceive conditionality in an incentive-based conservation program, and how this perception influence their participation in future incentive-based conservation program, right? So we were able to convince NSF and Fundación Natura, my collaborator there, to let us do this study. What we found, one thing I do want to mention, a very unique aspect of the study is it's the first time I was able to integrate a randomized control trial, field-based randomized control trial with ethnographic research, right? So this project took us 7 years from initiation, conceptualizing to finish, right? We were, these are interviews, pictures. These are our surveyors in the field. My students spend months in Bolivia, going from community to community and pitching up tent in community center. There's another picture of them like basically camping out in the middle of the field on top of a mountain because, you go to do interviews and the survey in rural areas, that's just what it is, right? I don't show that picture because it gave me a heart attack just every time. I didn't know they were in the middle of nowhere having a tent. If I knew, anyway, that was quite something, right? But so it was a lot of work, 7 years of work. We had household survey data, qualitative interview, a lot of participant observation. We also had administrative data from Natura, and we also had satellite data on forest cover. So we integrated all of these data, analyzed them. What we found here, fascinating. Offering unconditional versus conditional versions of the program did not affect any of the outcome we measured, right? So there's no statistically significant difference in participation rate, in intrinsic motivation of the participants, in the adoption of conservation practices, also in the actual measure of forest cover change during that period of time. Okay, so unconditional programs are not worse than conditional programs in terms of environmental outcomes. But we also didn't actually find any social, economic, and equity benefits of unconditional program as we hypothesized, right? So the results are really statistically null and quite unexpected. But we do think theoretically and practically they're meaningful, and our local collaborators are really excited because we just told them that unconditional payment also work, right? And they can actually reduce the frequency of monitoring, and they don't have to go after people to penalize them. It saves a lot of money, a lot of administrative burden. They can use that resources to actually, sign more contracts with more communities to actually push the program, right? So they are very excited. So the question here is, well, given these results, can we just remove conditionality from the incentive-based conservation program? Right? I think it doesn't really produce any ecological benefit. Maybe we'll just get rid of conditionality altogether. Not too fast, right? It really depends because we also have that ethnographic component of our research, right? So what we learned from that component is program participants actually perceive monitoring not just as a compliance mechanism. They actually like having Natura staff coming around their property once in a while, and they see that as opportunity to get any technical support they can from the NGO professionals, right? They're building relationship with them. They are, kind of all of these actually strengthening their relational value with nature and also with this conservation program itself, right? In fact, the program participants in the non-conditional treatment communities, they actually noticed the removal of conditionality, and some of them interpret it as quite a problem. They perceive it as Natura has abandoned them. They literally use the word, Natura used to do program in our area. They come back every year. I really enjoy having them. I've been many years, but they just stopped coming. What happened? They have that sense of abandonment, right? So what we learned from this research is really the role of conditionality. Maybe that's in this context, it's less about surveillance and penalty to ensure conservation, but more about serving as an avenue to activate and strengthen community members' relational value towards nature and implementing organization, which in turn will shape their conservation practices and future program participation, right? So that relational value is actually really powerful, right? That, it is something we started to look into more and more in different programs too. All right, I will give you one last set of factors. There are just so many interesting things, right? And they're all sort of connected. And again, I didn't rehearse beforehand, so all right, bear with me. The final set of factors I want to kind of highlight for you, right, beyond the economic consideration and information is the role of formal, informal institutions and governance structures. And we really see the importance of these factors in a variety of study contexts, right? So we saw it in Northwest China, where we saw it in Northwest Pakistan, where we studied river management, water quality improvement. We also saw it in Peru, right? In the Arequipa region of Peru, where we studied climate adaptation, and mining development and water governance, right? So all these projects were initially motivated by a need to understand how rural communities, particularly smallholder farmers and pastoralists, how they perceive and adapt to climate change, and how do we develop programs to support their adaptation effort, right? So, but later, as we continue to do the research, all of the climate change focused projects got expanded to focus on broader range of social ecological change, right? And I will talk a little bit about that in a minute. But regardless, we collected again quantitative data from each study. And what we found is quite interesting, right? So in China, as I kind of briefly mentioned earlier, adaptation decisions are very often stabilized and failed or failed depending on how they align with existing institution and governance structures, right? So we talked about how people like to planting maize, and maize planting as adaptation strategy stabilized because it really fit local labor and risk management strategies. On the other hand, drip irrigation as adaptation strategy failed because it required cooperation and time commitment that conflicted with, smallholder farmers' migration-based livelihood strategies. It conflicted with a decentralized land system in China. It conflicted with the lack of collective institution in the past 50 years in the area, and it conflicted with existing irrigation governance structures that are more individual-based rather than collectively based, right? So in China, it was very clear institutions and governance structures really mattered for adaptation. In Pakistan, it's the same. We also saw this very important role of for both formal and informal institutions. In terms of informal institution, really shows up as it's manifested as this joint, often multi-generational household structure, right? In that part of the world, that is the predominant household structure with, multiple generations living together with a smaller family units in a bigger household, right? And a lot of decisions are made at this larger household scale rather than individual family scale, right? And there's a lot of associated cultural norms, related to this joint household structure that really influenced how people prioritize what adaptation strategies they would take versus not. There's also a lot of broader governance arrangements going on related to water irrigation, authorities, water infrastructure systems. There's an establishment of water user association, the rules they are using to manage water, to manage water decision making. There's a lot of push for post-conflict development initiatives focusing on hydropower and the domestic tourism. And all these broader governance arrangements, again, shaped the spaces within which household adaptation decisions are made, right? So it's not just about climate change. It's also about how to take advantage, of some of these other opportunities being presented by the government, by the NGOs through the broader governance arrangement, right? So again, for informal and formal institutions and governance structures in Pakistan really shaped household adaptation decisions. And finally, in Peru, we saw the same thing, right? Again, because the part of the country we're in, people there are a lot of established water user association, right? So, and they are in charge of making irrigation rules and how do you, as a community, acquire access to water and how do you distribute water for agricultural purposes. But these irrigation governance rules, they tend to privilege Spanish-speaking male landowners, right? But so by doing that, women, Quechua speakers, migrants, renters, older pastoralists, they face a lot of institutional barriers to actually influence water decisions. And because they couldn't really get engaged with water decisions, that also constrained what they can or cannot do at household level, what they can do to adapt to climate change and water shortage, right? So what we really found in this study is that people's adaptive capacity within the same community can be very different, not always because of their access to material resources, but often shaped by people's intersecting identities and how these intersecting identities interact with the formal and informal water governance institutions, right? So altogether, right, I think hopefully I have demonstrated my first two arguments, right, beyond economic consideration and beyond ecological information, the power of social norms, emotions, relational values, formal and informal institutions, and governance structures, right? If you remember, I also have my third argument. I know our time is running off, and I thought about it ahead of time. So I will only say a few things very briefly about the third argument, right? So here, we're still looking at decision by decision. We're looking at them as, one decision-making process, a next decision-making process. But in reality, right, if you really zoom out to look at the decision-making as an entity, decision-making as an enterprise, right? In fact, we realize the decisions are very rarely singular or isolated events. There is sort of a continuous ongoing process that people are constantly changing their beliefs, their actions in order to address multiple stressors simultaneously and to manage multiple forms of risks and uncertainties in their life and to pursue multiple benefits, right? So, for example, in the case of Peru, when people think about the climate stressor, they're not only thinking about climate change, right? I'm going to get less water. They're also thinking about, climate change may potentially dry out the soil, right, and increase, the event actually in that part of the world, almost like a dust bowl, right? Like a basic soil just got, blown up into the sky. Both is the air quality issue, but also a lot of the very precious soil will just go away, right? How that interfere with their ability to continue to engage in agriculture. They are thinking about the mining development that coming into the area. So it's not just about climate change, it's also within the context of climate change, mining is also use a lot of water and also decrease water quality. And they also have to address that consideration. There's a lot of labor migration opportunities in the area. There's a fading water infrastructure in the area. So anytime you want a household to think about one stressor, they automatically think about many other connecting stressors. So anytime they're making a decision to take some kind of action within their household, it has to address all these different stressors simultaneously. It has to allow them to manage these different risks and uncertainties simultaneously, and it has to allow them to actually generate different benefits, not just to help them adapt to climate change, but also help them to improve their livelihood, help them to address water quality issues, help them to improve family health, right? So really, my last argument is resource management, conservation, adaptation decisions. If you zoom out to look at them, they're rarely singular, isolated events, right? It's really this, they're really kind of ongoing process in a broader multiplicity context, right? So now putting all of this back together, this was the initial slide I showed you at the very beginning before we took the tour around the world, right? So thank you for indulging me, taking you through, all these little projects I've done in my career. But these are the three arguments, right? So I will continue to pursue, to generate evidence, to show, and I'm very happy to be proven wrong, right? But I do think it is very important. It's not to say information and economic consideration are not important. They're absolutely important. Very often they're necessary in terms of behavior change. But my argument is just simply they're not sufficient. They're necessary, but not sufficient conditions, right? And I would really strongly hope and encourage everyone to think beyond information and economics, to pay attention to this very broad range of social, psychological, cultural, institutional factors that will influence, resource decisions, conservation decisions, and adaptation decisions, right? So you may ask me, at the end of the day, so what, right? We know all of these are complexity, but how does that complexity help us, actually improve people's lives, improve sustainability of the environment, and improve people's adaptive capacity? I think, I don't have an answer to that question, very important question, but I think these parts that are highlighted in red probably could serve as a starting point, right? So anytime we're developing a resource management program, we're trying to promote a conservation practice, we're trying to set up some kind of adaptation initiative, we need to think about not just that one thing we care about, but also how does that fit into the way people live their lives and manage their livelihoods and manage their resource, sort of broadly, right? How can we build in mechanisms that allow people to address multiple stressors at the same time? And what are the multiple benefits people could potentially derive from engagement or adoption of that conservation practice beyond just ecological benefits, right? So I think that multiplicity, attention to multiplicity of resource management, of conservation, of adaptation would be a good starting point to start implementing some of the changes that needed to happen on the ground, right? So, yay, that being said, thank you again for having me here. And I guess I have a little bit of time. Isn't the class officially finished at 4:15?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, all right. But if you need to leave, leave. But if you have questions, let me know. All right, thank you.